Welcome to Harris Hall, the afternoon reconvening of the Board of County Commissioners' regular Tuesday, June 13th meeting. And Mr. Rickoff, good afternoon. Good to see you.
Chair Farr, it's good to see you, but I am going to abdicate the chair at this point.
Thank you.
It's a relay race.
And Ms. Mokrowski, we have a panel with us today to give us what I've heard is good news. Have you heard that same thing?
I think it is good news, and I'll turn it over here to our finance manager, Greg Holmes, to introduce the item and walk through this with our auditors.
And Greg, if I may, just make an announcement. We do have an elected official with us who's not a Board of County, one of the commissioners, and that is Sheriff Harold. Welcome to Harris Hall, Sheriff Harold. You often live here, so I don't need to really welcome you. So please, Greg, go ahead.
All right, thank you, Chair Farr and Commissioners. It's my privilege to be here with you and be with the team from Moss Adams. On my far left is Amanda McClary Moore. She's a partner with Moss Adams. And here next to me is Kevin Muller. He's presented before the board, and he's the senior partner or senior manager with Moss Adams. And so Moss Adams is here to present their results of the audit of the county's fiscal year end June 30th, 2022, as well as their examination of the tax levy that supports jail beds and youth services. And we're going to go through that presentation. We're going to give a chance for the sheriff, Sheriff Harold, and Greg Rickoff, of Director of CGRS, to speak to the levy and the results. And then we chose this year to leave the motion for the board to accept. We'll be asking, recommending approval of the order in the matter of accepting the Lane County Annual Comprehensive Financial Report, commonly referred to as ACFR, for the fiscal year ended June 30th, 2022. If you could do that at the end. And just to recap how we got here, Moss Adams finished their audit of the county's ACFR on April 28th, 2023. Again, I really appreciate their patience in that, as we had transitions in county finance, almost 100% turnover on our general ledger team. So they finished up and wrote their audit opinion on April 28th, 2023. On May 8th, 2023, they completed their examination of the tax levy. And then, according to accounting procedures, Moss Adams met with the Finance and Audit Committee on May 18th, 2023. But really, we're here today because the board had made a commitment to the voters of the tax levy, here to have an annual review by an independent party, which is Moss Adams, that we're complying to what we said that we were going to do when we asked the voters to approve the tax levy. And so that's what we're here to do. And then we're going to have the sheriff. And that is, and the report is supposed to be to the sheriff and to the board in a public meeting. And so that's what we're asking them to be there. So with that, I'm going to hand it off. We have a PowerPoint that Moss Adams prepared, and we'll go through that.
Thank you. And Mr. Muller, welcome. Ms. McCleary Moore, welcome. Thank you for being here this afternoon.
Kick it off.
Sure. It's not reporting up there. Should it be? I'm seeing it on the screen, but I'm not seeing it up there. Is that?
Maybe Tanya can help you.
It's on this. It's on the laptop, but it's not popping up there. I don't know if you told me a step, and I didn't listen to the whole thing.
Oh, Diana, are you sharing?
I can go ahead and share if you'd like me to. I have it up on screen.
I got it.
You did tell me to share a screen.
It's okay.
This was my bad.
There's no bad. There's no bad.
All right. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you for having us here today. As Greg mentioned, we're going to go through our results of all of the work that we did this year. We just have a short agenda. We'll spend most of our time today talking about the local option tax levy, but we'll go through the other services that we provide and our results of those as well. Just to mention our audit team a little bit. So you already were introduced to Kevin and myself. There's a couple other members of the team that we wanted to point out and highlight to you. One of them is Ashley Austin. She's a partner in our Portland office. She performs a concurring or technical review of the financial statements as well as all of our audit reports as part of the audit. At Moss Adams, we find it important to have an independent person that's not on the day-to-day activities of the audit to do just one final independent look to make sure everything is correct and that our reports are accurate. Then we have Harvey Wang, so he's the manager on the job. He's kind of the face of the audit, right? He's dealing with your team as well as our team. He helps the staff. He works on complex areas, so he really kind of is the face of the audit. Of course, there are a number of other members of our team that are not listed on the slide here. We have some seniors and some staff, and we utilize IT. Staff within Moss Adams as well, so, but just wanted to highlight a few of the familiar faces. So as part of our audit of the financial statements of your ACFR, we perform that audit under two sets of auditing standards. The first set is our generally accepted auditing standards, so those are the standards that we follow for all of our audits. The second set of standards is those governmental auditing standards, and we're required to follow those standards because in addition to the audit of your financial statements, we also audit your federal awards because you receive well over $750,000 in federal awards, which requires us to perform that additional audit. Out of that comes an additional audit report and we'll go through our results. That really, the purpose of that report is to identify if we identify any internal control deficiencies, which means an error could potentially slip through the cracks, and it gets reported in that report if we identify anything of that nature or some sort of material noncompliance. So you get that additional report that comes out of the governmental auditing standards. The second bullet point up there is in addition to all of the accounting standards that you have to follow that the GASB sets for you, your team has decided to obtain the GFOA certificate, which means that you get an award annually for the presentation of your financial statements, which means they're easy to read, and it does require some additional information that's not required under GAAP, which if you look through your financial statements, you'll see a statistical section in the back that has about 10 years worth of history of various financial and other operating type indicators, as well as an introductory section at the beginning of your financial statements that starts with a nice transmittal letter that highlights some of the things about the county. So because of that, we do look to make sure that you're still complying with those additional requirements set by the GFOA. The third point up there is because you are an Oregon municipality, Oregon says, okay, Oregon auditors, you have some additional rules that you have to follow and audit as part of your government audits over compliance. These are areas such as use of your gas tax money, procurement, following procurement laws under the Oregon revised statutes, but we spend most of our time probably looking at compliance with your budget, the budget law. So, and then we issue a separate report on that. And then the fourth item up there, as I mentioned, you do have a single audit over your federal awards. This year, we audited 3 of those awards as part of our audit. The fifth item up there is because you do have that levy that requires you to have an examination over the assertion and the schedule of revenues and expenditures. We do complete that as well. And then the last item up there is on reporting, which is what we issue our reports at the end of our audit. They get bound with your financial statements and then, of course, our communications with you. So those 4, I'll go through the 4 audit reports that we issued. The first one is over the financial statements. So our responsibilities under the audit are to express an opinion over your financial statements on whether they're fairly presented in accordance with GAAP. We were able to issue what is called an unmodified or clean opinion. Now, while this is something that I know that you all come to expect as part of the county, we always like to say, congratulations on that. Your financial statements are well over 200 pages long. It requires a lot of effort on your team in order to draft those financial statements and put them together and comply with not only the standards set by the GASB, but those additional requirements under the GFOA. So I always like to pause there and just say congratulations on that. The second report up there is that governmental auditing report, and this is where if we identify any sort of internal control deficiencies, we have to evaluate those and determine whether that there's a significant deficiency, which means a significant error could slip through the crack, or a material weakness, which means a material error could slip through the crack. We did identify one material weakness this year, and it's really just related to the financial reporting and how the pension proceeds were presented in the financial statements in the original draft that we received. That was fully corrected by management. We were able to issue our unmodified or clean opinion, but it did require that one correction and resulted because of the dollar amount of your pension bond, it just rose to that level. And then we did not identify any compliance findings that would be required to be reported in that report. The next report is our Oregon report, our Oregon Minimum Audit Standards report, and it also requires us to report on those internal control items, and so we have that same finding related to just the presentation of how the loan was reported within the funds in that report as well. And then there were two budgetary violations. Even if you violate your appropriations by $1, they have to be reported in there. So there was two funds this year that had over expenditures, and so those were reported and mentioned in that report as well. And then the last report is over the single audit or our federal awards audit. As I mentioned, we did audit 3 major programs this year, and we expressed unmodified or clean opinions on each one of those awards. In addition to that, we do have to report on internal control as well, similar to how we do in the financial statement audit, except for these are internal controls over compliance, and we did not identify any internal controls deficiencies over compliance that rose to the level of significant deficiency or material weakness that was required to be reported in there. So a clean report there. With that, I am going to turn it over to Kevin, and he's going to walk through the local option tax levy examination.
All right, thanks, Amanda. So that was the June 30, 2022 financial statement audit of the county. I'm going to talk about the tax levy for public safety for June 30, 2022 year end. And we issued a report that basically has 2 parts to it. The first is the local option levy fund, which presents the revenues and expenditures of the fund during the year for jail and youth services. The second is the 6 assertions that the county told the community when the levy was first passed years ago that they would commit to not only fulfilling but having independent audit firm verify those 6 assertions, and that's what is in the report, and I'm going to highlight that today. So the first assertion is that a local option levy fund would be set up, so a unique special revenue fund. And the purpose for that is to make it clear that those tax dollars aren't commingled with any other county business. It's not in the general fund. You can see how the dollars are being spent. So we saw that fund continued to be spent, and as part of the financial statement audit, we issued a clean opinion on that fund. The second assertion kind of addressed the risk that when this fund was established, the general fund would no longer continue supporting jail services. So we tested the assertion that the general fund did indeed provide funding for community corrections. So we got into the accounting system. We saw that the general fund was funding community corrections. So that assertion was met this year. The third assertion relates to how jail beds are used. And the commitment was to use at least 250 adult jail beds, So our team visited the county jail. We also looked at bed counts that were conducted, so that occurs 3 times a day. We did a sample of all the bed counts, and we're very comfortable that 255 adult jail beds continue to be used during FY22. And then with youth services, the commitment there is that 16 spaces are used for youth detention and another 16 for youth treatment. So we did the same sort of test with that facility, and we saw that the 16 beds for detention and treatment were again being used during FY22. So that leaves us with 2 more assertions. The first is the tax assessor, all the collection of the FY22 property tax dollars, how is that being allocated between those 2 programs? We saw that, as expected, 91% of those tax dollars went to the jail, and the other 9% went for youth services, detention, and treatment programs. Now, in some of the prior years, that allocation was a little different for various reasons, and we saw that those older tax dollars that were being paid in the rears were being allocated as they were set forth in those prior fiscal years. And then the final assertion was that the Special Revenue Fund that accounts for all this would get a clean opinion, and as part of the audit, that fund did indeed get a clean opinion. So the county had 6 assertions, and we saw that all 6 of those assertions passed with flying colors. So I think we can see that the county is doing what they set out to do. I think that's, yeah, and that's the extent of my comments on the tax levy.
I have a quick question about tax nomenclature and tax language with flying colors. Could you explain that in more detail?
Well, I don't have an aviation license, but I think that's a good thing, right?
It seems it. Thank you. That was tongue implanted firmly in cheek.
Understood.
So, Mr. Holmes, anything else before we go to questions and comments from the board? Actually, I do think there is one additional part of the presentation. Sheriff Harold and Mr. Rickoff. Mr. Holmes, I'm going to turn it back to you. I'm messing up the order of the agenda here completely.
Thank you, Commissioner Farr and Commissioners. So
I might have messed up the timing. I
No,
was
I'm
trying
handing
to
off
get
to
on my way
Sheriff.
up
No,
here.
I appreciate that.
Thank you, Chair Farr and Commissioners. Thank you, team from Moss Adams. Obviously, very pleased to hear the jail levy audit. Not surprised, pleased, of course. It's our 10th one, right? And I think on the heels of our latest renewal and the amount of conversations I had with the community about needing to renew this, my comments are mostly around being pleased with the process that was set out back in 2013 when Sheriff Tom Turner first worked to get the levy, and recognizing that the public wanted to hear these things. They wanted to be assured that if they voted yes, the funds would be used in this way. And we've now established a 10-year track record of demonstrating to them very publicly in this process that, in fact, we've stayed true. And 79% of the voters said, okay, we'll give you another 5 years. So I think I'm just really pleased that the folks that were engaged in that process in 13 had this in place. And as I talked to the community to ask them to give us those next 5 years, they expressed that they were pleased that this process was in place. And then, just earlier this morning was engaged in a conversation with some of the other county directors and staff, just sort of general observations that we were making, which is that when the public agrees to pay more taxes, our observation is typically they agree in cases where there's a real defined purpose for the additional taxes. And we all have conversations about the general fund is our most flexible funding, which is designed to run all the functions of county government. Of course, it doesn't pay for all of the functions we need. But the public seems willing, when there's a defined specific need, to agree to pay for that, at least more often than they agree to pay more taxes for a variety of services that the government wants to offer. So I just really appreciate this opportunity. And again, the public was very interested that this happens annually, that they are They are given a public presentation that says, we use the money just like we said we would. So thank you all for continuing that for the last 10 years, for helping me to ask for another 5 years of the same process. I appreciate your support for all that, and I appreciate the good work from our partners. Thanks.
And Sheriff Harold, before you leave the mic, I just wanted to point out that you deferred all credit, or much of the credit, to the initial work done by former Sheriff Tom Turner, who we miss dearly, who passed this last year, and we think about him continually. And thank you for deferring the credit. But you, and also Sheriff Trapp, also have a great deal of credit in continuing what has moved into an 80% passage in the last version. One other person I would like to talk about who was really instrumental in the preparation of and the passing of the initial levy, and that is Sergeant, then Lieutenant, then Sergeant again, Carrie Carver. We think about Carrie quite often, and I'd love to hear reports on how Carrie is, and remember with great fondness the tremendous amount of effort that she put in, and how Tom always said he could not do it without Carrie.
Thank you.
Chair, could I add to that just a
Please.
bit? Yeah, Clay Farrell, but you're standing here, Sheriff, and you don't get enough chance to brag about yourself, so I'm going to help you out a little bit. You know, I've been around Eugene all my life, been around cops all my life, been around chiefs of police all my life, and you, sir, are one of the finest men of character I've ever met. I just want the public to know that.
So before you leave the mic, and since I took a shot toward you, anyone else have words for Sheriff Harold? We rarely get to see him directly at the mic. If you don't, I'll say a few more. But actually, Sheriff Harold, thank you so much for the work that you do, and continuing to make 80% seem like, you know, just second nature.
I will say this, I certainly learned how hard Tom Turner worked in 2015. Well, I didn't even learn, because it had to have been even harder for him, so.
Can you say how many different presentations you made throughout the course of the preparation?
42 public presentations.
Say again?
42.
42. And that's from one end of the county to the other. Perfect. Thank you, sir.
Thanks.
Mr. Rickoff.
Chair Farr, Vice Chair Trieger, members of the Lane County Commission, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's an honor to share the podium with Sheriff Clifton Harold. His work this spring has been both remarkable and inspirational. I'm Greg Rickoff. I'm the Director of Community Justice and Rehabilitation Services. My thanks to the continuously stellar work of the Moss Adams engagement team. As always, I'm grateful and humbled to work with so many outstanding staff. The members of the various teams that the sheriff and I get to support, they really do remarkable work. I would like to express my gratitude to the voters of Lane County for entrusting us with the resources to better serve the community. I'm grateful to the board for supporting the work of our two departments in forwarding the levy renewal to the ballot, and then working diligently with the voting public to help them understand the importance of it. This levy does provide funding for 8 beds in detention and 8 beds in the Phoenix Behavioral Rehabilitation Services Program. Those are essential beds. It's with pride in the purpose of public service work of so many different individuals to come before you and affirm that it has been verified by our outside auditors that we keep our word. Thank you.
Can you say that one more time?
Chair Farr, we keep our word.
Well, thank you. Mr. Holmes, am I free to move forward with the comments? Then I'm going to look around the board. Any comments or questions for the entire panel? Commissioner Senega.
Yeah, I'd just like to say thanks for this audit. When you go to one of Sheriff Harold's public sessions, it feels really good to have this audit and to know that what you're saying is, I mean, there's not a doubt in my mind that this was going to pass with flying colors, as the term's used. So thanks a lot for your hard work, and Sheriff, thank you for your hard work, and Rickoff, thank you. I sure appreciate it. You make the job easier.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Lovell.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just some casual observations about the audit. Man, that was some thorough reading, I got to tell you. It stimulated my senses. all, what was it, 259 pages of it. I think some of the things I pulled out of it, which were kind of, in my mind, I'm looking for what markets are doing and how we're doing as a county and that kind of thing. And I think just for the public, I just wanted to bring out some things in the audit that we are now looking at 12% higher housing costs in the area just in the last year. Obviously, it's more because this was almost a year ago now. We're looking at 10% of the reduced amount of permit applications. Obviously, that's attributed to the cost of money these days. We were comfortable and happy at 3.5%. Now we're sitting at 7.5%. I heard of a commercial loan just the other day a guy got for building a building, 11%. I haven't seen that since my first house in 1986. So we're facing that as a county. Just in the last year, we've gotten about an effective 15.8% inflation rate. So as they say, inflation is running faster, and we're not keeping up. And then the other thing that I thought was kind of interesting is just where we're heading as an employment sector of Lane County. It was kind of revealed in your audit that 30% of our gains were in leisure, accommodation, and the service industry. I think obviously that's coming off of COVID when we were having that big, shutdown and all that, but still it showed us that we were still behind because the lowest amount of gains were in manufacturing, logging, and what was identified was that your percentage of 3% growth was self-employment. And as a self-employed entrepreneur all my life, that really hit me in the gut because those are the kinds of people that creative employ people, and they also work really hard for family wage jobs in their own businesses. And I felt that the public needed to know that we're kind of behind in that area. And the other thing that was revealed last year, which is obviously more expensive now, is the average cost of a home is $440,000, which if you look at the cost between 3.5% interest and now it's 7%, that puts about a quarter of the people that qualified a year ago for a house out of the marketplace. And so that's something that we as a county really need to look for going forward, is some creative ways to get people financed back into homes so we can turn some of this increasingly ugly tide around. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner, for the discussion. Then I'll say, the 6 assertions that you read one by one. When we first talked about this levy 8 years ago now, when we were first talking about it, we failed to pass public safety levies over and over again. We didn't have a very good success rate, so we really did some examination as to what it is that the public really expected or maybe expected. Some of it was a hypothesis on our part. But really, we believe that one of the main problems that people had with passing levies is that then the general fund would be spent for something else. Well, we asserted that that was going to be the case, and you verified today for the 3rd time that that wasn't the case, that we didn't take general fund money and supplant it with levy money. Did not happen. And the other thing that is it would be used for very specific causes. This time it was 9% for youth. 91% for this very specific addition and continuation of the predominantly circuit court assigned jail beds. And you gave us for the 3rd time the assertion that we did do that. And then the other one was that there was going to be no commingling with other county business, which was the first assertion that you read. And you made certain that for the 3rd time you told us that we did do that. So all 6 came out clean, and really that is what we hope for. And as Sheriff Harold said, we hope for, we expected it, and that is the case. So thank you for the work that you've done for highlighting this to the public that we did. Mr. Rakoff, what did you say? We keep our word, and really that's ongoing, and it has become standard order of business for us. So with that, we have before us Order 230613-04. Do I have a motion? Vice Chair Trieger.
Thank you, Chair. I'll move approval of Order 23-06-13-04 in the matter of presenting an audit of the local option tax levy fund that supports jail beds and youth services for fiscal year ended June 30, 2022, and results of the Lane County, Oregon Annual Comprehensive Financial Report, accepting the ACFR for the fiscal year ended June 30, 2022.
Moved by Vice Chair Trieger and seconded by Commissioner Buck. We have 230613-04. Discussion to the motion? I'm seeing none. I'll call for the vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Passes unanimously. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. McCarthy, when they said, as we clear the room, when Ms. McCleary Moore said, every single dollar has to be accounted for. That made it really evident that how tight this is. You know, that when they look for defects in or weaknesses, they call them, in our account in the accounting, they just don't find them, even right down to the dollar. So congratulations on that, Ms. Mokryski. And with us today, we have a panel, and I'm going to say hello to Planning Director Amber Bell. But Mr. Mokryski, I'll turn the floor over to you.
And I'm going to turn to Amber, our planning director, and go ahead and take this item, Amber.
Thank you, Steve. Good afternoon, commissioners. Thank you, Chair. So I'm coming before you today to present a draft letter to the Department of Land Conservation and Development, requesting that we're asking that they make the request for rulemaking for emergency rules for sheltering and interim housing on lands outside of urban growth boundaries for people displaced by the housing crisis and who are experiencing homelessness. To summarize the letter, it requests that DLCD propose rulemaking similar to the Oregon administrative rules that were adopted in 2020. Those were temporary rules. And then in 2021, that is when LCDC adopted permanent rules to provide shelter and temporary housing options for persons displaced by the 2020 Labor Day wildfires. Only this would be for shelter and temporary housing options outside of UGBs for persons displaced due to the housing crisis and who are experiencing homelessness, as I mentioned. So to give you an example, the rules for wildfire response included things like for unincorporated communities, there were options for, or are rather options for transitional housing. For temporary residential uses included a single manufactured dwelling, use of an existing building, up to 2 yurts, up to 5 RVs, up to 5 tents. For rural residential exception areas, and I won't go through each zones, but just to give you some examples. There were similar temporary residential uses, but instead of up to 5 RVs and up to 5 tents, the allowance was up to 3 RVs or up to 3 tents, and that was through a type 2 procedure. There's also some uses that would allow for temporary campgrounds. So just to give you a sense of the kinds of uses that we're talking about. So this was prompted in part by, we became aware that another county in March of this year mailed a similar letter to DLCD. So we wanted to place this draft before you to see if this is a direction that the Board of County Commissioners in Lane County would also like to take. So I will say I view this letter just as a small step towards one tool. It's certainly not a fix the housing crisis. The rules that were adopted by LCDC for wildfire response were for temporary housing and sheltering, and this isn't, they did not provide allowances for permanent housing. Generally speaking, there were some allowances for replacement dwellings, but that aside, by and large, they were temporary uses that were allowed by those rules. And so just in conclusion, at this time, today I'm requesting direction on whether the board would like to proceed with sending this letter on behalf of the board.
Well, thank you, Director Bell and Director Bell. We have the letter in front of us, and anybody wishing to follow online can click on View Items, and the letter is in its draft form before us, pretty much as you read it. Just very quickly, it seems to be in compliance with what the board has identified as a real reason to find any way that we can to add housing in Lane County because of the crisis, the emergency that exists, not just in Lane County, but throughout the state. But it seems to be, particularly in light of Mr. McAllister's testimony this morning, exceptional in Lane County. So with that, we'll go to questions or comments. Commissioner Buck.
Thank you, Chair. I'm fully supportive of the letter. I was just curious, what was the other county that sent the letter?
That was Deschutes County.
Deschutes. Great. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Vice Chair Trieger?
Thank you. I'm also fully supportive, and I imagine this kind of detail will come after we get a response to the letter, but I'm wondering if there's any reason to include in the letter something about this being an add-on, because if there's a total number already allowable temporary in response to folks displaced by wildfire, that we're asking for a second layer or number of inventory, and that it not be a sum total, cumulative total. Does that make sense what I'm getting at?
Thank you. Commissioner Lovell?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'm also too in support of the letter. I think the only question that I have is at some point, like when Commissioner Trigger was saying, Vice Chair Trigger was saying about some of the details coming out later, at what point does temporary become not temporary was my question. When we talk about temporary housing, I mean, we just looked now at the Holiday Farm fire. What was it, 2 months ago? We just had the last people out of a hotel. That was 2.5 years. So at some point, we're going to have to define what temporary really is so that this policy doesn't, I don't know, lack of a better word, get abused or lengthen out or doesn't have an end date and there's no enforceable kinds of parameters to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Very well. It looks like we're ready for a motion. And, you know, as we as we move forward with this letter and this request that we're forwarding, I would hope and expect that we'll get positive results from it. And it's going to the DLCD, Department of Land Conservation, and as Lane Shirley always pointed out, the last word is development. And really, what we're in the process of right now is finding ways to develop housing in Lane County because we have a tremendous, just a few hundred feet from where we're sitting here, we have a tremendous need for housing in Lane County. So with that, I will look for a motion.
I think this was just a.
Oh, it is. No, it's not. It's not a motion. Our options are, we do have two options, right? And one of the options is to approve the letter or elect to mail the letter to DLCD. So, looking around the board, head nods, anybody opposed to this? You've already stated opinions. Thank you, Director Bell, for bringing this to us. And Ms. Mokrajski, thank you for signing this letter once it is in final form. And we will, do you know, have a time frame on when we might hear back the results?
So
This is DLCD.
I don't have a time frame. The letter is drafted, of course, as you mentioned, to DLCD, to their director. If they entered into a rulemaking process, I'm not sure what that time frame would be, but I'd be happy to return with an update if we become aware that they enter into a rulemaking process or propose a rulemaking process.
And would the rulemaking process involve LCDC?
It would.
So which might stretch it out. Very good. Okay. So LCDC and DLCD, that's a department of and the commission for. Thank you. Very good. Well, thank you, Ms. Bell.
Thank you.
Then we'll move into commissioner's business. Do we? Oh, I'm sorry. We do have one more. Put my glasses on. And we have a discussion of the Lane County Planning Commission recommendation on a potential interpretation of Rural Comprehensive Plan Goal 5. And with that, Mr. Mokrajski, I'll ask for you to introduce your panel.
Thank you, Chair, and I'm going to turn this over to Amber again to introduce the discussion and provide the presentation and answer any questions the board has.
Thank you again. So Amber Bell, and then I wanted to introduce Shauna Adams. She's one of our senior planners in our office. She often focuses on current planning and has been involved with, has been at the county about 5 years. So I'm not sure how frequently she's been before the board. She's been a key player as part of this group that's worked on taking this item to the Planning Commission, and she'll be available to answer questions as we go through things. Rachel Surslev, another one of our senior planners who we know, who you all know, unfortunately was unable to join today. She had planned to join, but unexpectedly was not able to. So I know she was hoping to be here, though. So this is a report back on the Home Builders Association's interpretation of Goal 5 Policy 11 that was proposed last May. And to provide a recap of the change of case law that prompted this matter, the county understood for a long period of time that the maximum density standards did not apply directly to development proposals because the requirement had already been implemented into the development code. However, then there were two cases issued by Land Use Board of Appeals and Court of Appeals, commonly known as Nibkish and King, that changed that understanding. And the result of those rulings are that for new forest zone residences proposed within the major big game habitat, they can't be approved on parcels or tracts that are smaller than 80 acres in size. And new forest zone residences proposed within peripheral big game habitat can't be approved if the parcel or tract is less than 40 acres in size. And smaller parcels were held by LUBA to constitute a Goal 5 conflict, and a new residence can only be allowed after an economic, social, environmental, and energy analysis to overcome the conflict is adopted into the rural comprehensive plan. So that's just a little bit of background. And my apologies, I do have a PowerPoint that I'll pull up here momentarily. My apologies. So just to continue some background, you may recall the home builders emailed a proposal for an board interpretation of Goal 5 Policy 11 last May. We came before the board for discussion and a work session last June. And at that time, the board had provided the direction to go forward, take the matter to the Planning Commission. We met with the Planning Commission 2 times on December 6th for an initial work session, and then they continued that to January 17th for a second work session. And I did want to note that while those were not public hearings, they did hear from the public. There were at least 3 persons who provided testimony at the general public comment that's offered at the beginning of the Planning Commission meetings. And there was a few letters that were provided to the Planning Commission as well on the topic. So this is the focus of the main part of the LUBA decisions is Goal 5, Policy 11. This is what's at issue, and it's the county's policy regarding the protection of big game. And then, while not specifically adopted into the Rural Comprehensive Plan or the code, LUBA found that the county's protection measure was found in the working paper. So this is just this is a screenshot of the working paper. I won't read that; it's lengthy, but just wanted to provide that. So some additional background. At the June 7th board discussion, these were the options that were discussed. We discussed elevating the next relevant hearings official decision to the board for review. That's per Lane Code, Lane Code 140805. And then at that time, the board could adopt local interpretation of the policy or affirm the hearings official's interpretation or move to go through an on-the-record review. The other option was to initiate a board interpretation process pursuant to Lane Code 1608. And again, the board directed at that time to take the matter before the Planning Commission. So to provide a summary of what we discussed with the Planning Commission, so we went over the background of the county's Goal 5 program, the state requirements for Goal 5 big game. We went over the issues that were addressed in those 2 cases, the Nibkish case and the King case, that were issued from LUBA and Court of Appeals. And we discussed that presumably the board could adopt a local interpretation, likely, and this was after having consultation with county council, that LUBA would afford the county's decision with deference. But whether an interpretation would result in a different outcome before LUBA might be complicated by the existing case law. We understand that LUBA conducts a legal analysis when cases go before them when issues have gone before them before, and they review whether to review arguments again, and that factors in whether there's new legislative history or an important argument or evidence that hasn't been presented to them before. Excuse me. However, there is discussion in the LUBA's opinions that suggest that they might not revisit arguments if the case were back before them. For instance, they state that the county's program is reasonably clear, and they find that the density standard is necessary to comply with Goal 5. I'm paraphrasing at a very high level. We also discussed with the Planning Commission examples of other jurisdictions adopted Goal 5 programs that include adopted residential density standards or calculations or wildlife combining zones similar to that of Lane County, and I'll get into those in a moment. And then we discussed procedural considerations that we discussed with the board, which I summarized in the previous slide. So then on January 17th, we provided responses to planning commissioners' questions, and they discussed the matter. To summarize their discussion, they talked about that an interpretation should be made through a land use decision or a process that allows for engagement of a broad range of stakeholders. They talked about that an interpretation following a LUBA opinion could create an undesirable precedent. That is of a party approaching the board for a new interpretation of a case law that issues a decision on a particular matter. And then they discussed that there's a need for clarifying or providing more transparency in the rural comprehensive plan policy and land code, how big game is protected from residential development. They noted the level of complexity of and the resources that would be needed for that kind of work. They didn't provide a specific recommendation, and they noted the need to evaluate potential options. These were the options that were provided to the Plan Commission. Again, the same that were, generally speaking, that were provided to the board. And then on January 17th, these were the two recommendations that the Planning Commission provided. They provided two, one specific to the home builder's interpretation. That is, they recommended that the board take no action regarding the home builder's proposal for the board to adopt a local interpretation of Policy 11. They also, though, recommended that the board direct staff to scope a post-acknowledgement plan amendment to make amendments to Policy 11. So Rachel has begun scoping Goal 5 updates and what that might entail so that we can better understand the kind of options that might be discovered through that process. We wanted to just have a initial understanding of what that kind of project might look like that we could discuss with you today. So she was going to cover the next couple of slides, so I apologize. I'm going to do my best here to summarize what the good work that she's done so far. So the options that we understand thus far are that if it is the direction of the board to proceed with scoping an update to Goal 5, the kind of options that we might be looking at are a lane code amendment to implement the 40-acre and 80-acre density standard. There are some counties that, and I'll discuss this in a moment, there's some counties that have a little bit of have a similar standard, but they have a little bit of flexibility or a variance process, so that's something we could potentially scope and determine feasibility of. And then there's the much larger Goal 5 policy 11 or Goal 5 update, which could include a new inventory, working with ODF&W to adopt new maps. It could involve going through the whole Goal 5 analysis process to identify the conflicts, determine the impact area, analyze EC consequences, that's economic, social, environmental, and energy, and then develop a new program to achieve Goal 5. So it could be a much larger overhaul of the big game, county's big game protections. So then as part of our research that Rachel has begun to do, we looked at what other counties are doing already. So Lynn and Douglas County currently have a very similar density standard to Lane County of a maximum residential density standard of 40 acres and 80 acres. However, like I mentioned, Lynn has a variance process for residential densities that don't meet that standard and allow some level of clustering. So there is an example of a little bit of flexibility that other counties have implemented into their codes. So generally, when counties initially adopted their comprehensive plans, the Goal 5 resources were inventoried and protected through measures, typically adopted into their codes, and those can be minimum lot sizes or standards for the location of specific development with the purpose of minimizing impact on big game habitat. And many jurisdictions did that and continue to have those codes in place. In Lane County, of course, we thought we had done that until the Nipkish and King decisions. And then we also have begun to scope or research what other counties have done to update their programs. In doing our initial research, we found that there's 2 counties that have begun or have updated their big game programs. One is Wasco County and the other is Deschutes County. Their programs are fairly different from one another because Wasco revised habitat for the entire county, whereas Deschutes' project, I believe that's in the works, that's only for one specific big game species and for specific areas of their county. So generally, we found that these projects can require significant financial resources and staff time. They can take several years to scope and carry out. And additionally, a complex project like those may involve a consultant. In fact, we know that Deschutes County has brought a consultant on board for their project. Since Lane County has a tiered habitat inventory, the major, peripheral, and impacted big game, that's similar to what Wasco County had before their amendments. So we'd be likely looking at revisions that affect a larger area, potentially the whole county. And that would be more of a sort of a program overhaul, similar to what Wasco County did versus a smaller scope project like Deschutes's. I'll note that it would likely be a pretty significant undertaking in comparison to a code amendment. So if this is the route that we were to go, the purpose would be to explore different measures from the 40 and 80 acre minimums to protect big game habitat or to adopt more current data on big game habitat areas. And I'll also note that not until we go through that process will we know how new mapping, if we were to go through that process or scope it, would we know what new mapping would look like and what the protection measures would be. There could be a scenario where more impacted areas receive less restrictive measures and less impacted areas receive more protective measures or combination thereof. It's unknown at this time. The other thing I'll note that if a less restrictive standard can be adopted, it's somewhat unclear the extent to which that might result in an increase to housing stock. Currently, the F1 zone prohibits new dwellings, and the F2 zone allows new dwellings, but it does require, and this is pursuant to state law, it does require a type 2 special use permit process before a dwelling can be built. Just to give you an idea of the number of dwellings that exist in the county that are on F2 lands versus the entire county outside of the urban growth boundary. So we requested from GIS a number of residential addresses outside of the UGB, and that's roughly about just shy of 30,000. Zoned RR and outside the UGB is just shy of about 20,000, and then just shy of about 4,000 are zoned F2. We don't have the data on how many of those existed prior to zoning versus how many have been permitted over the years. But it is interesting to look at the Department of Land Conservation and Development publishes a biannual report, and their last one, or rather their one from 2019, noted that from 1994 to 2019, there was an average of about 55 forest template dwellings that were issued annually, or 1% of F2 dwellings countywide. And then we looked at some permit numbers from 2013 to 2022. And when looking at that, one thing that is interesting is that there was a kind of a spike of the number of permits template dwelling permits that were approved in 2019. And then that number decreased in 2020. And so we just note that House Bill 2225 was issued, or became effective rather, on January 1, 2020 in Lane County. The NIMCISH opinion was issued a little over a year later in January of 2021. So one thing that this might suggest is that there was some level of impact due to House Bill 2225 on the number of dwellings that were being approved, template dwellings that were being approved in the county prior to NIMCISH. So just a couple of other considerations. If we receive direction to scope a Goal 5 update, we would either look within our existing work program and staffing resources and prioritize the existing long-range projects that we have in the queue, or we will need to identify resources and potentially look for a consultant. And then today we do request board direction regarding the purpose or desired outcome of scoping if it's the direction of the board to move forward with a Goal 5 scope. And then with that, these are the two options and to provide the Planning Commission's recommendations. Our recommendation is regarding the home builder's interpretation that the board take no action. And then again, in alignment with the Planning Commission's recommendations, that the board directs staff to scope options for a Goal 5 big game update, and then return to the board with a formal project proposal. And that concludes my presentation. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Planning Director. Any further presentation from the panel? Okay, then we'll move forward with the discussion. I have a quick question before we get going. Planning Commission has a recommendation with two parts to it. One is to recommend the board take no action regarding the Home Builders Association. Just toss that aside and say no. And the second part of that is to move to recommend that the Board of County Commissioners direct staff to scope a post-acknowledgement plan amendment. And I'm a bit lost in that sentencing. Can you describe that a little bit further in about 3 sentences that somebody who's not a planning director could understand?
Sure, happy to, and apologize for the jargon. I believe what that's referring to is any time after the comprehensive plan is adopted and the implementing code is adopted, the procedure that we have to follow to amend that is referred to a post-acknowledgement plan amendment. That just means after the Land Conservation Development Commission adopts our comprehensive plan, then it is the process that we have to, the formal process to go through to amend that with notice requirements and hearings and such.
So number 2 is a recommendation by the Planning Commission, but that has to happen anyway. Is that what you're saying?
So
That will happen even without the planning, without us adopting the Planning Commission's recommendation. That is a part of the process. A post-acknowledgement plan amendment.
If the board's direction is to proceed with the Goal 5 scoping, we would first scope that project and then bring it back before you. If we ultimately proceed with a type of plan amendment, Goal 5 plan amendment, then that would be the process. And it is the process, you're correct, in any event. Anytime we amend the county's comprehensive plan, we have to engage in that process.
Okay. Concludes my pre-questioning. Then we'll go to questions, comments from the board on the presentation. Commissioner Buck?
Thank you, Chair. You had mentioned that the second recommendation comes after the LCDC Commission approves our comprehensive plan. Are you in the middle of doing that comprehensive plan right now? Are we waiting? I'm trying to understand the timeline.
No, so we haven't engaged in any comprehensive plan amendments at this point. The Planning Commission has provided the recommendation that we scope potential options, and one of those options that come out of that scoping effort might be that we initiate a comprehensive plan amendment process, but we're not
Ours is already
pursuing one of
complete.
those.
Our regular comprehensive plan is already complete and approved. Okay.
Yes, correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. further questions or comments? Commissioner Lovell.
Thank you, Chair. I got to say, I've got a lot to unpack, so I'm going to just take it in bite-sized chunks because this is something that's really dear to me, and we've had a lot of complaints and a lot of issues about this since coming on board in January. You mentioned also, too, that the ESCE needed to clear the way for adopting programs or direction. So is that another entity of which another layer that we have to work through before this? And forgive me, the word scoping, I'm not quite sure what that means. Does that mean like we're actually going to do something, or we're just going to check and do something? What does that actually mean?
The way I'm thinking of the scoping, if we're directed to move forward with that, I'm going to go back to the slide that has the options listed. So the scoping would be looking at these options and looking at what's involved with each of them, and in terms of resources and process and feasibility, and then weighing, whether we could determine the extent to which we could determine the outcome of those. So it's just, the scoping would be exploring these options and then coming back to the board with more information about these and the different considerations around them. The EC analysis is, that's an analysis, it's a step it's a procedure that's required as part of the Goal 5 Policy 11, or any time you enter into a Goal 5 process to inventory or protect or amend the program for Goal 5. So that could be a quarry, it could be a Class 1 river, it could be a wetland, protected wetland. So any of the Goal 5 resources, that's our process that we have to follow, except if we go through a safe harbor, what's called a safe harbor analysis. So we have to go through those steps. And it stands for economic, social, environmental, and energy analysis, which are just the factors that we have to consider as part of that.
When you say resources, does that mean our own internal resources with enough people and hours to do this job in a timely manner? Is that what you're referring to?
Both. I think I referred to it in used the term in two different ways. So are you asking about the scoping exercise or the Goal 5
Well, and
EC
just
analysis?
the overall 50,000-foot look, I'm looking, okay, if we decide to move something forward, do we have the personnel to move it forward in an effectively timely manner, or are all these people whom we're now talking about having issues of developing their land going to be waiting another 2 years for the slow wheels of government to churn? So I'm looking at maybe doing something a little more expedient than what we have resources for. So that's my question. Do we have the resources to do this expediently?
Thanks for the question. So we have a pretty busy long-range work program at this point. We serve at the board's direction. We're happy to proceed however the board provides direction and wishes. We would need to take a look at the long-range work program and determine how it could fit in. It may result in some other projects being rescheduled, possibly being delayed, but I would presume that we could look at scoping within the next year.
Okay, I've got one more thing, and then I'll go for another round. I've learned some wonderful things from Vice Chair Trieger, so I just want some clarity on this as well. When you look at Goal 5 on the website, it states that cities and counties reviewed land uses allowed on or near each resource site that might have a negative impact on the resource. Then they then decide on a level of protection appropriate for each resource site and adopted codes to put their policies into effect. So when you look at Goal 5, what some of the major parameters are is we're protecting resource, which you mentioned earlier, could be mining, could be river resources, that kind of thing. Might I add to that commerce, farming, and might I also maybe have us look at this in the further questions that we adopt in this session, that housing is a resource. So I'll hold my other questions for the second round. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Further comments, questions? Vice Chair Trieger?
Yeah, just, excuse me, for the moment, a quick question. The first two bullets, the difference is between identifying, creating clarity around standards versus amending it with some, can you just describe a little more the difference between the first two bullets?
Yes. So the first one would be essentially maintaining the status quo as it is today, taking the standard out of the working paper that's buried in the working paper and case law and putting it into the code, because currently, without it being in code, that can take property owners off guard if they're not used to navigating the code every day. So that would just put it in the code. It's something that we could proceed with. It's relatively easily. I hesitate to say easy when it comes to land use, but that's something that if the board wanted us to go that direction, we could proceed with that. But it would be maintaining this current status quo that came out of the Nipkish and King decision. And then the second one is to explore whether there's options to, and we don't know what the feasibility of this would be at this point, but to explore whether there's options, like Lynn County has a calculation where they have a variance process where you can have a smaller property if there's other siting standards that are met and things like that.
Okay. So that first one, in a way, I mean, that could be something that we might want to do no matter what, so that in the meantime, before we get to whatever the thing is, we're doing nothing, but we might as well provide greater clarity, or we're going to embark on some kind of process that may or may not change the standards, but in the meantime, we might as well provide clarity of what the current situation is. Is that right?
That's certainly an option, and I apologize. I should have made that clearer. I don't view that first bullet as being mutually exclusive from a larger project. That's something we can move forward to provide clarity while also exploring other options.
Great, thanks. I noticed Keir popped on for a minute. I didn't know if he was just tuning in or had something he wanted to add, but that's all I have for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Further discussion? Commissioner Seneca.
You're bringing up Lynn County's flexibility in their chart. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more, or do you know much about what they're using?
My understanding is, and Rachel could probably answer this better than I, because I think she spoke with their planning staff, but my understanding is that they have a variant sort of section where they look at a slightly larger area than just the subject property. If you go through, you can calculate it on a slightly larger area or denominator to still meet the density standard on some level while also meeting other clustering or siting standards.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, with everything that's going on and all the presentations we hear, we need housing, housing, housing. I hate to become more restrictive.
Thank you. Commissioner Buck?
Thank you. You had mentioned that there's some other long-term range activities that you're already planning in your department. Can you name some of them so we get a sense of what they are?
Sure. So on an ongoing basis, we work with the cities when they have projects that need to be co-adopted or adopted. So we have a number of projects with the cities of Lane County that are in the works. We have our code modernization project that our next step would be to update the rural residential, rural commercial, rural industrial zones, and rural public facility zone. We're working on some updates to Chapter 13 to address a number of things that have come to our attention over the last few years. We're working on our legislative and housekeeping code update. That's in the drafting stage right now. Trying to think of some others. There's, yes, ADUs, of course, will be coming back before you this summer. We have a code amendment that's in the works that is slated to go back to the Planning Commission this summer to define the term footprint in the floodway code. FEMA has issued a preliminary map revision for the Willamette area to update the floodplain mapping, and so that's something that we'll be bringing through the adoption process here in the next year or so. There's also, we're working on a couple Metro Plan amendments. We had a Metro Plan amendment go before Eugene, Springfield, and Lane County joint public hearing to evaluate amending a Metro Plan policy that would allow extension of sewer line to Goshen and Short Mountain landfill, the landfill for the transport of leachate. So that's just to name the handful that I can think off the top of my head.
That's a lot.
Some others as well.
That's a lot. I think, under all of that, what you're conveying is that you're pretty busy. And knowing that, this department continues to have underfunding, we would likely, to pursue this, we would likely need to identify some other outside funding in order to pay for the work or to bring some people in if we wanted it to be done in any timely manner. Because some of those are pretty high on our priority list already. I know that we're also, Commissioner Seneca and I we're also working on that RFP but that's a consultant. So we have to identify other money, right? In order to pursue this or determine which of those projects we want to delay. And I don't know this for sure, maybe you can answer it. Some of those may have deadlines that we need to be cognizant of. And so I feel like we would just need to be educated a little bit more about what those trade-offs will be.
I'll say a couple of things first. This is a big deal. And it's a big deal because it affects so many people. We hear from so many people about how difficult it is for people to use the land the way they had anticipated using the land for, in some cases, generations. And all of a sudden, Lane County's interpretation, our existing interpretation of the land use, some of it's based on case law, but some of it's based on just what we've developed internally, makes it more difficult for people to do what they wish to do with their land. And I think it's really important to me personally to make it more understandable to people, and also to find ways to yes as opposed to elevate obstacles to no, that provide a no. And I think we are blessed in this county with Landwatch Lane County that's helped us to really be afraid of making land use decisions, because we're afraid of what they will do. And they've been successful sometimes, but as often as not, in fact, probably more often than not, they're not successful in their obstruction to developing the land that people own. And I think that, to me, it's very important that at this point in time in particular, we set a course for this county that makes it easier for people to use land to develop residential, for residential purposes outside of urban growth boundaries as contained inside of the Oregon law. There is flexibility. There is room for interpretation inside the Oregon law. That's correct. We know that because other counties have developed, in your words, flexibility that other counties haven't implemented, that we haven't implemented. We don't have some of the flexibility that some other counties, Deschutes for one, has. And what I'm interested in, what I am highly interested in, and I share this opinion with a lot of people, finding flexibility. Finding ways in our county to use the flexibility that's allowable inside of Oregon land use law, which is not unlike the U.S. Constitution, subject to interpretation. Subject to interpretation based upon what it is you want to have, the way you want it to be interpreted in some cases. And I think that, to me, it's important that we find ways within Oregon law to be as flexible as we possibly can in Lane County. Now, the decision that we're talking about today, the instructions that we give you today, there are two main considerations. One is policy considerations, and the second is financial or resource considerations. Do we have the resources? Do we have the financial? Well, you have a pretty strident work plan laid out in front of you, lots and lots of big work that requires a great deal of staff resource. But what we have to determine is what is the most important thing for us to do with the resources that we have. And I contend that the most important thing we can do with the resources we have is to find greater flexibility in land use law, but as it pertains to residential use outside of urban growth boundaries in Lane County, to find greater flexibility in allowing people to develop residences outside of urban growth boundaries. That's my statement, and that's, to me, any discussion that we have from this point forward will be surrounding that statement. Finding flexibility within land use law using Lane County's ability to interpret the law in ways that make things, that get us to yes. I have a few more things to say.
I'm just noting that Kier has his hand up when you're ready, Chair.
Okay, thank you. So financial or resource considerations, the financial considerations fall back on what the board determines is the most important thing. Now, are we supreme in this decision-making? No, we're not, because I personally rely on you, Planning Director Bell, to give me good information as to what the decisions that we can make and the best way we can use our decision-making capacity here at this board. And by and large, you have done that, and I've trusted you since the day I met you, and I continue to do so. But I really want to find more flexibility. Let's take a look at what Deschutes County did. How can we implement some of that flexibility? Let's look at what Lynn County did. How can we implement some of that flexibility and find ways to get to yes outside of urban growth boundaries? Now, how many acres are there? We're talking about 40 or 80 acres plots. How many acres in Lane County? Anybody? Just a little over 3 million acres in Lane County. 3.02, something like, just a little over 3 million acres. So there's a lot of land in Lane County, which really does indicate that there's a great deal of flexibility to find ways to interpret Oregon's land use laws in ways that make it easier for us for people to develop residences outside of urban growth boundaries. Now, we have, on F2, you say there are 4,000, maybe 4,000 residences outside of, well, they're all outside of urban growth boundaries, about 4,000. That's not a lot. You know, I mean, that's, in a county this size, 4,000 residences is not a great many. In some of the other land use codes, you know, there are greater numbers of residences. But anyway, I'm gonna finish it with, in this first round, that's where I'm going, is greater flexibility, finding ways to get a yes on this. So, Kier, Mr. Miller, you have your hand up.
Thanks, Chair Farr. And actually, you stole a little bit of my thunder there. I did want to kind of first say, yeah, I completely, staff level, we understand, we completely agree with sort of the concept of finding opportunities for housing. And in this sort of discussion, I did want to just point out, when the board is thinking about prioritizing workload, as Amber mentioned, you know, we serve at your pleasure. We take on the projects the board wants us to focus on. I was glad to see there is some discussion in the memo about the overall size of the housing inventory on forest lands outside of, you know, the cities, and the percentage of that is an overall total of the housing stock in the county. It is, I know it's very significant to the folks who live out on those properties and who've been thinking all along, you know, I have 10 acres, I have 20 acres, someday I'll be able to build a house on it. So it's significant to them in the overall capacity of housing. It's a small percentage, and not that it should be discredited at all, the need to allow for housing opportunities. I do want to just point out that there are a number of things, as Amber mentioned, on our current work plan that also involve, you know, finding more front doors and housing that are critical. I would contend the accessory dwelling unit project is probably a very high priority for everyone. The code modernization work that we've been doing, that is all around creating that certainty, reducing ambiguity in the code, finding options to get folks where they need to be. So I appreciate the discussion. I don't really have any recommendations. It's the board's call. I will say that, you know, I think what staff have laid out in terms of, you know, proposing, you know, direction on should we scope these various options is important, because I'll tell you that a Goal 5 inventory, a Goal 5 programmatic review is going to be a big undertaking. There's lots of ins and outs to it. And maybe that's just the additional information we need to go away and we need to really figure out. These are the realistic timelines if this was handled in-house. These are the things that would come off the long-range work program. If you want to go to an outside consultant or someone else to do this work, we could develop some estimates around costs and those sort of things.
Thank you for that excellent input, Mr. Miller. And I'm going to ask this question, and you and/or Director Bell or anyone else in the room can answer this. Have other counties done a scoping of code of
Goal 5.
the Goal 5 and the, has anybody else done it? Or has Deschutes County acted without that? Has Lynn County acted without that?
No, they've gone through the goal. Whenever a Goal 5 inventory needs to be updated, counties are required to go through that process. I know Deschutes County currently is working on one component of their Goal 5 inventory that involves mule deer populations in Lane County. For our big game, we have more extensive range. We have different species. So it'd be a larger undertaking here, but no, those other jurisdictions are required to go through that same process. The other thing I will mention is as I think the board understands, but we're kind of in this boat because for years and years, we implemented a pretty generous view of what was required under our Goal 5 program. It's only because of these challenges that now all of a sudden we're forced to tap back into the Goal 5 and look at these things. So it's not something we've done before in the past. That's why we're proposing a scoping. It's a big undertaking, so we can't come to you with great information about this is exactly how long it would take. These are the sort of obstacles that we might deal with at this stage yet.
And thanks for that, Mr. Miller. So clearly, Deschutes County and Lane County are very different in terms of what the applicable, what the fauna existent and flora, for that matter, existent in the counties. But Lynn County is a little bit more like Lane County. Has Lynn County done a scoping project that you're aware of?
I can answer that. I don't, not to our knowledge. Perhaps they've started to research that, but the only two jurisdictions that we're aware of that have done updates or scoping are Wasco and Deschutes.
Wasco and Deschutes, neither of which is very much like Lane County in terms of their general landscape. Very good. Let's move down go back to this for the second round discussion. Commissioner Lovell.
Thank you, Chair. Where do I begin? Amber, sorry to put you on the hot seat. I know you're probably, got things you want to do today, but I've got a lot of questions from some of the constituents that's been emailing me about this. I have a couple of rapid fire questions for you. When did this Goal 5 Policy 11 policy go into play? Was it, I'm thinking, is it 1984 is what I've been gathering, or was it later than that, or where are we at with that?
It was 1984.
84, that's what I figured. So anyone who's bought a piece of property after 1984, is it within our information of people buying property like that they're aware of some of these overlays that have been on the property? Because some of the people that, like Chair Farr said, who've had these properties for generations expected certain things that they were going to be able to do with their grandkids or what have you, and all of a sudden now they're restricted to doing that. So I'm wondering if since 1984 have we implemented as a county a policy to inform buyers of rural property that this could be a possibility of development hurdles in the future?
Well, for pretty much since 1984 until 2021, when the NPCIsh decision was issued, we were under the impression that the density standard did not apply directly to development proposals. So in response to your question about whether they were aware of the mapping had been adopted, and that's publicly available on GIS. So anytime anyone comes in to pursue a development proposal and they talk with the planner on duty, or they're working through a land use application, we would pull up that information, and if they weren't available or aware of it, we would provide that information and talk through the implications of that. But our decades-long understanding was that the density standard did not apply, so it really took us by surprise as well in 2021. But since that time that we became aware that it's not in our code but does apply, we've provided some information that's posted on our website, and we provide that information as well at the planner on duty counter.
Okay, so how does the big game interpretation, who determines that? Is it the ODFW?
Correct.
So has the ODFW then made an interpretation of what is big game? And then do you feel like maybe the county is kind of backed into that policy rather than being more strategic and intentional of developing their own policy with regard to what specifics kinds of wildlife we have, like Deschutes County? Obviously, they've got more wildlife than just one, but they only specified one breed of wildlife to protect only on a certain region. Have we embarked on maybe some of those kinds of conditions in our own county?
Thanks. That's a great question. I don't know what all went into ODF&W's providing or creating the data that went into the adoption of maps. In the 1984, ODF&W provided us with the maps, and then the county reviewed them and adopted them at that time. Presumably, things have changed since 1984, and their data would be maybe reflect different conditions today. And different recommendations. If we went through a new process, we would be working closely with DLCD and ODF&W using the data that comes from ODF&W, but it would be a Lane County process. But I apologize, I don't know specifically what their process is to develop the maps in 1984. Maybe we would be happy to follow up with that.
Okay, maybe I
If she has.
If I may, I'm not sure what the ODF&W process was to develop the maps in 1984. I know they've changed. I know that their density recommendations were developed based on the best research that they could find at the time. And there was a lot, and I believe they continue to basically adhere to the same recommendations, density standards today.
I'm wondering if the owners of those properties that are in the research database were consulted on maybe some of the wildlife movements around their own property, or were they informed, or do they have a public process in that? Do you know?
I'm not sure. We would be happy to look into that.
Well, according to what I've heard from them, they weren't part of the process, so that's part of the problem with our owners. And like you said, there's only about 4,000 properties that are being affected here, but we have to also remember that as county commissioners, we don't just serve the metropolitan area. Those 4,000 people are super important to me as a county commissioner, even though I represent the district of Springfield, but we have an obligation to represent them just as fairly as we do the metropolitan area. So I want to put that on the record as well. Also, too, I want to look at just one more question on this round, then I've got some more for the next round, is just the value of property. I've had a couple of people that have wanted to sell their properties and then came to the point of selling where they can't because of certain overlays of wildlife, and more specifically, it was elk wildlife, and I want to get to that in a moment, so bookmark that one. But here in your presentation, in your board packet, you mentioned on the page that says Draft County Board Interpretation of Goal 5 Policy 11, page 2, attachment 3, you said that board determines that Policy 11 is not an independent standard for review of dwelling applications on existing parcels land. More specifically, the ODFW recommended parcel sizes, 80 acres in major big game habitat and 40 acres in peripheral big game habitat, are not minimum standards for individual dwelling applications on F2 units of land. LC 16.211 states the exhaustive list of standards for template dwellings on F2 lands. So some of the people that have come to me on F2 lands wanted to build a structure. Adjoining to them on 3 sides of their property is other F2 lands of the same size or similar sizes that have structures on them, but yet when they go to the county, they can't build one. I've got 2 people in specific that I can do. One, Dana Westfall off of Jasper area, and then another person, Daniel Bassaroba in Cresswell, who's got these kinds of issues going on. You look at the piece of property they're asking about, and all around them there's houses on same size pieces of property, but all of a sudden now they can't build on this property for the reason undetermined. So I want to make sure that we're going to help those folks, because that, to me, I scratch my head and go, I'm not understanding why that's an issue. The other thing about value is I found this interesting too, in that same page, the page after. It says the F2 zone has been applied to lands designed as forest in the comprehensive plan. The provisions of the F2 zone reflect the forest land policies of comprehensive plan, as well as a requirement of ORS Chapter 215 and OAR 660-006. It says this: the minimum parcel size and other standards established by the zone are intended to promote commercial forest operations. which I found interesting that here we are, we're fighting the forest industry at all counts as a county because, for whatever reason, but yet part of our plan is to promote commercial forest operations within the F2 zone. So I want to make sure the public's aware that I'm aware of that, and that's why I'm fighting so hard for the timber industry to do what they do best, and that's environmentally responsibly reinvest forest lands for the best and highest use. Then I want to just do one here, then I'm done for this round, is about value, sources relative value. How do we ensure the value of someone's land? If like Commissioner Farr or Chair Farr said that this land's been in the family for generations, and in their mind there's a certain value to it because they're going to be able to build on it, and they're facing a situation where they can't, how do we ensure the value of the land if unsuspecting landowner finds that they can't build on a land they originally bought with the intention that Goal 5 allows them to do? And in the quote of Goal 5, it says this: the determination of quality requires some consideration of the resource's site's relative value. So if we as a county have put policies over their land without their agreement or knowledge or participation, haven't we as a county stripped some of that value away that we, by fairness, should be able to compensate them for? That's some of the complaints that I've been hearing from the constituents that have contacted me, is they've lost a large degree of relative value because what was thought of was a buildable parcel of land is no longer. Further, those people who have those kinds of big game property that we're speaking of, I can't imagine how over an 80-acre or a 40-acre or even a 5-acre parcel, how the footprint of a house is going to prohibit a herd of elk coming through my property. The only thing that prohibits that is like a 25-foot fence. So as far as some of the migratory disturbances that we're maybe citing in this particular policy and level, I think maybe we should take another look at. And I'll pause there, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Is the board further comments? Then where do we go from here? You know, I'm in looking at Wasco County. Wasco County's spent about a year so far, it looks like, and it's been a pretty intense project. Now, in comparison to Lane County, Wasco County has about half the size. It's about half the size, and it's a little bit topographically different, you know. In terms of population and urban growth boundaries and cities, there are about less than 30,000 people in Wasco County. So they're not really affected by urban growth boundaries as much as Lane County is. So I think I'm trying to put all of this in perspective as to how do we get to a position where the people that we represent feel that we're moving forward with the needs of landowners, while at the same time recognizing the difficulty and the impact of moving forward with any wholesale changes to the way we interpret Goal 5. So, so you've given us two options. One is to take no action. Excuse me, that's to take no action regarding the Home Builders Association proposal, and to direct a scope of post-acknowledgement plan amendment. So if we ignore the recommendations of the Lane County Home Builders Association and say, you know, that's invalid, we disagree with that, then how can we reassure them that we are paying attention to the needs of the people who have issues with the way they're unable to develop their land? So help me out with that. How can we be moving forward without adopting what it is that the Home Builders Association is recommending that we do?
That's a great question. So I think that that's part of what the Planning Commission, I don't want to speak for them, but my understanding of part of what they were grappling with, what led them to the second motion was, you know, not proceeding with the home builder's interpretation, then what? Because there still is the need for clarity and transparency of the standard and providing that information to homeowners, and exploring whether there is potentially a solution to the big game density standard. And so I think that that's something that we can, if we were directed to proceed with the scoping project, we could explore those various options and whether any of those are feasible to create a more updated program, potentially less restrictive in some areas.
Okay.
It is I will say it is difficult to know, specifically what the outcome of those different options will be until we really go through that scoping and even until we go through the potential project. But we would gain more clarity through the scoping project.
Mm-hmm. So to summarize these considerations, the Lane County Goal 5 update project would likely require years of work, and resources would be needed to identify to be allocated. So we would be years in the process, according to your analysis. And at the end, I think your conclusion is that there's no clear indication that it would that would increase the availability of land for residential use outside of urban growth boundaries. Is that a fair assessment, a fair
I
statement?
think that's a good assessment.
Okay. Further discussion? Commissioner Lovall.
Thank you, Chair. I think I'm here. I hear what Chair Farr is saying, just about kind of in his tone, the frustration of the length of time this is. I think we should direct staff to elevate the next relevant hearings official decision involving Goal 5 Policy 11 to the board for their review pursuant to Lane County 14.608. The Board of County Commissioners by state law can interpret ambiguous law. That's our job. So the board could adopt a local interpretation of the policy either by affirming the hearing's official interpretation or through an on-the-record review. And we could also direct staff to initiate a board interpretation process pursuant to Lane Code 16008. So I'm here trying to get the problem solved today, if we can. I'd like to move the needle on it today. And I think if we could say that you could hold to whatever figures you're at now with 40/80, okay, that's fine, but let's push maybe those decisions to the Board of County Commissioners, because by law, we have the power to interpret state law and to interpret ambiguous law. Let me just add this too, which is kind of interesting. We talk about the wildlife game habitat overlay, and over I hear about elk habitat. And it's interesting that elk habitat, we're not talking about a real huge endangered species here, elk, right? I mean, they're not like African rhinos or wildebeest. Every year, for the public record, we issue thousands of hunting permits because these animals are on the verge of being, quote, a nuisance, according to the hunting guides. Owners of 160-acre parcels are granted landowner harvest tags to mitigate the damages they cause to their property. Further, property owners have stated elk, deer, and mixed game come to, through, and over their properties, regardless of any built obstructions they have. They come right to the homes' fences or in their gardens, and they're ever increasing in numbers over the last 5 years. So I think we need to start listening to our citizens a little bit more, is my take. And I think the Board of County Commissioners should take back this ambiguous law and make their own interpretations in the face of whatever risks or perils are in front of us, and we'll face them when we get there. Chair, thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Buck?
Thank you. Just as a follow-up question on that, do you know why the Planning Commission did not recommend that and instead went this way?
I remember the specific discussion around directing staff to elevate the next hearing's official decision. I mean, certainly that's always an option, I will say, in Lane Code Chapter 14 for us to bring before you. There's a set of criteria to evaluate, and if it's an issue of countywide significance, we would be happy to bring before you a decision. I don't recall this.
I think I'm trying to pull out of my brain what some of the last discussions we've had on that. In part of the response, I think in the past, and hopefully you or Keir are still on, is that could be done if a case came before the planning director that said, okay, we need to come to the board. But that entity or person that has that particular case would kind of be testing the waters in a way, delaying their implementation of whatever they're trying to do, adding expense to their application and adding a timeline to their application, if they're so willing to even go that route without really resolution as to what the outcome will possibly be. Given that we know that these applications are so often then litigated afterwards to LUBA. And so we place the applicant in a very precarious position without a known outcome for them when they're just trying to get their project done right away. And so that we just need to be cognizant of the situation that puts a person's application in when coming to the board and we'd have to wait for an application that qualifies to come to the board and an applicant that's so willing to do so and kind of put their project on the line in order to test that out. I think as thinking through this, that could be a longer process, potentially, than what's being presented before us. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner, for the discussion. Then, in response to that, which would be LCPC Motion 1, number 1, direct staff to elevate the next relevant hearing official's decision, et cetera. The landowner who would be involved in that would know ahead of time. I mean, they'd know that there would be a conscious decision on their part, probably to help us to pursue that. But to me, it seems almost a prudent thing to do, to precipitate a decision. In effect, is what this does. It precipitates further it eliminates further discussion because it brings us to a point where we have a ruling at the end of it. As lengthy as it may be, it does get us down a certain path, which puts me in favor of that option. That puts me in favor of directing staff to elevate the next relevant hearing official's decision, et cetera. And regarding motion 2, the NMCISH decision is in effect, right? I mean, as of now, that is in effect, as you have stated, Commissioner Krieger, and I think that's what you stated. You said regarding maintaining the existent, well, maybe I misheard what you said. But the NMCISH decision is in effect right now. So if we direct staff to scope option 5 for a Goal 5 big game update and return with a formal project proposal, then what is the time frame on that? Can you, is that pretty uncertain, how long that might be?
I would estimate that we could work on a scope and return in approximately the next year and a half.
Mm-hmm. And then alternate 2, pursue lane code amendment. Now you say that doesn't necessarily, that's not precluded by any other action that we take, that the lane code amendment is something that we could, that's a road we could go down at some point, really at any time. And no action that we take today is going to preclude that for the future.
Correct.
Okay. Then I'm going to suggest this, that we direct staff to elevate the next relevant hearing official's decision involving Goal 5 Policy 11 as stated in the packet that we have before us. And under motion 2, direct staff to scope options for a Goal 5 big game update. So it's bullet points 1 and 1 under both of those alternatives and options. Is that, did I state that clearly enough for you to understand it?
Yes.
And to the board, did I state it clearly enough for the board to understand it? It doesn't do anything regarding the NMCISH decision because that is in effect at this point in time. Any action on that is going to come down the road from this point in time. It doesn't preclude a lane code amendment, which is going to be expensive and time-consuming. We know that. But it does precipitate a decision regarding the next hearing official's interpretation of a Goal 5 Policy 11 decision. Okay. So any discussion regarding what I've stated as the route from this point forward? Commissioner Lovall?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. My only question was, does this allow any room for the board to interpret ambiguous decisions in this move that we're suggesting? Is there any room for that?
Well, I think the room for that comes inside of a elevate the next hearing official's decision to goal 5, the first bullet point that I've stated. I think that's where that latitude comes.
Okay, maybe I misunderstood. You were saying, year and a half to come back with a decision. I was just thinking of those people that are on my communication list, what I'm going to tell them. Sorry, got to wait a year and a half before we move this needle at all. Or can I at least say, hey, the Board of County Commissioners will take a look at this, and there may be a chance we could make some ambiguous decisions to move your cause forward. That's all I'm asking. I'm going to reserve that for at least part of our toolkit.
So then, could I add that maybe, I've given you 2 instructions. As a third one is to take, to individually look at what are regarded as ambiguous decisions on existent land use requests, and have the board take a look at them on an item-for-item basis, bring them before the board on an item-for-item basis to see if the ambiguity can be resolved. Now, I'm going to ask if that is clear, and then Commissioner Buck has a comment toward that.
If I
And Kier is up, okay.
could
Thank you.
ask for clarification on that, is the request that we bring template or forest dwelling decisions before the board if they're ambiguous?
I think that that is probably the main point of contention. But let's hear what Kier has to say, perhaps. Kier?
No, that was exactly it. I was just trying to get clarification and to maybe answer a little bit of the question from Commissioner Lovall. If the board gives us direction to elevate, that exactly what will happen is we'll get an application for a template dwelling based on the criteria in NIMCISH. We would need to, if they exceeded the density or they didn't meet the size requirements, we would have to issue a denial. It would then go through the appeal process. We can elevate it to the board. The board then makes an interpretation about this Goal 5 policy with findings generated by staff supporting why this is a reasonable, whatever the interpretation is, be it 20 acres or 40 acres or 10 acres, whatever the logic is, that would be adopted by the board as an interpretation to deal with the sort of ambiguity that's left out of the NIMCISH decision. So hopefully that answered Commissioner Lovall's question. But around timing, it would depend on when we got an application. If somebody is out there right now watching this issue closely and they see this as an indication that this will be an opportunity for the board to weigh in on this, they make application, we process it, and then it goes to the board for interpretation. But that can take some time. That could take several months. And it's really dependent on an applicant initiating the process.
And a lot of that, Kier, is based upon when the applicant initiates the process. It could be far less than several months. It could happen almost overnight, potentially. And then
Sure.
the extended length of time comes subsequent to the board making that decision. That's when any appeals may occur and other appeals to the board's decision. Is that,
Correct.
am I reading that correctly? Okay, Commissioner Buck?
Thank you, Chair. I just want to play that out just a little bit further. Because all that clearly can happen. A decision can be made by the board. But it's quite common for those to be appealed and then have to go through the state appeals process, which, again, could take years. You just never know. The length of those. And I guess if you have a willing applicant that really wants to go through this process, okay. But I find that puts applicants in a very tenuous situation. And, for somebody that has the time and the money to do that, that's fine. But there are applicants that don't have the time or the money to do this. And it's similar to, I guess, what I was stating before, which is why I'm just going to state for the record that I support the Planning Commission's recommendations, specifically because the timeline's unknown and the applicant is put in a very tenuous situation.
And thank you, Commissioner Buck, and I'll see if I can make my response fairly clear to that particular contention, that what supporting the Planning Commission's recommendation says no. There's no ambiguity. No is the answer. But if we direct the staff to elevate, as I suggested, no is not the answer. What makes it tenuous is that no is no longer the answer. That it's a maybe. You know, it's a step toward yes, as opposed to an absolute. What the only lack of ambiguity is no, you can't do it, period, and that's the end. The board will not take it any further than that. Whereas elevating it to the elevating it as stated in point 1, without, I'm not going back and read it over again, gives a willing applicant the opportunity to say, okay, I accept no, or I will work with the board's decision to see if we can find a way to yes. Does that seem clear? I mean, no or maybe is what we're looking at.
I think that if you generally characterize that correctly, Shauna reminded me that part of the Planning Commission's discussion was along the lines of that elevating the next hearing's official decision. There's unclear timelines. It would be involved in an appeal, and then there's the question of whether LUBA would reconsider the issues. But I think you're correct in that if no action means no action, and to elevate the next relevant hearings official decision does give the board that ability through that process to affirm the hearings official decision, affirm or modify the interpretation, or to open on the record hearing. So there's that opportunity if that's the board's direction.
It gives the board some flexibility and allows us a step closer to a possible yes, is the way I'd look at that. Okay. Well, very good. Vice Chair?
Thank you. Maybe it's just because it's end of a long day and this is confusing, but I don't hear taking the Planning Commission's recommendation as a no, because it explicitly says if we take no action on the home builder's interpretation, is the parenthetical I've added, staff will continue to monitor hearings official appeals and, upon hearings official's decision on this issue, can propose to elevate the appeal to the Board of Commissioners. So it's still an option. It's not a no. It's a no on directing you to always elevate to us, right? Yeah, that's just making sure I'm understanding in my own words what that option is. Great, thank you.
And I don't know that it's always elevate. It says it's the next. Relevant. The next single hearings official decision, not always. So, I mean, I guess it's a matter of just which set of goggles you look at it with. And to me, this by adopting what I stated, and to me, it's an opportunity, a greater opportunity for us to find a yes. Still might not find a yes, but there's an opportunity down that path. So. With that, I've suggested my recommendation. There may be a little bit of dissent or disagreement among the board, but my recommendation is on motion 1, go with number 1, and on motion 2, go with number 1. So to the board, is that the direction that we wish to give to staff? And to staff, before I ask for that, is that clear direction?
It is clear, thank you.
Okay. To the board? There's not a vote, but I'm seeing at least 3 head nods as this is the direction that we're asking you to move toward, which would direct you to elevate the next relevant being the key operative word, hearing officials' decision involving Goal 5 Policy 11 to the board for their review. At that time, the board could not, but could adopt a local interpretation of the policy, either by affirming the official's interpretation or through an on-the-record review. A lot of flexibility in that, and a lot of room for discussion down the road as to whether or not it is appropriate for us to adopt a local interpretation or to agree with the hearings official. So, or to agree with your bringing it to the board and say, well, yeah, thanks for bringing that, bring us the next one instead. So it gives us the flexibility in my estimation. So with that, I think you've received your instructions. If there's any ambiguity on my part or any unclarity on my part, let me know at this point in time. Otherwise, and Keir, are you still with us?
I am, yes.
And I've been talking directly to the planning director, but your input has been invaluable. Anything else you'd like to add?
No, I don't think so. We have direction and we will take it. Thanks.
Thank you. Very good. Then that concludes that item of business for the day.
Thank you, commissioners.
Thank you. And now we'll move along to Commissioners' business. Announcement from the Board of Commissioners. Any announcements? Okay. Well, then I do have an announcement, Ms. Mokraiska, and that's regarding our nonprofits. I said I kind of telegraphed this earlier in the meeting that I wanted to talk about nonprofits. You know, we have in Lane County a robust set of nonprofits that help us with a number of our policies, decisions, and really take the pressure off of Lane County in many ways, take the pressure off staff by actually doing the work themselves. And some of that work involves housing. Some of that work involves distribution of food. Some of it involves a whole host of different things, policy regarding individuals' rights, for instance. But nonprofits, we have a lot of nonprofits in the county. And Ms. Mokraiska, you have the task before you to bring requests by nonprofits for board support. Sometimes it's a monetary request, sometimes it's a policy request, and sometimes it's a continuation of an existing program. And I think that by the time we as a board look at decisions whether or not we are going to support nonprofits in their work, once again, whether it be housing, whether it be distribution of food or whatever it may be, that we trust that nonprofit, that we have a high degree of trust in that nonprofit, that we don't really require minutia of detail of exactly how they move forward with their plans, because by and large they get a great deal of work done, work that otherwise would not have been done. There are a couple of nonprofits that really come to mind, long-standing nonprofits that have been my favorites for a long, long time. I love Shelter Care. Shelter Care has done a superb job of using pass-through money from Lane County to provide services and housing and other peer supports that otherwise wouldn't happen without Shelter Care. Another one is Looking Glass, that does a superb job of working with youth in our community and does a superb job of coordinating efforts. A lot of it with money that's passed through Lane County. Sometimes it's Lane County money, sometimes it's passed through Lane County. And another one that really does a superb job is Catholic Community Services. Catholic Community Services is the largest distributor of food from Food for Lane County to the people who need food in Lane County. And then the other one, another one that I'd like to mention is St. Vincent de Paul of Lane County, my favorite of all. And the reason that St. Vincent de Paul is my favorite of all is that they're the #2 distributor of food in Lane County, of Food for Lane County's food. Their numbers are in the millions of pounds of food that they distribute. Beyond that, they have been and demonstrated an innovation in how they provide housing. In Operation 365, for instance, much of the housing that we provided to veterans, we provided 404 housing opportunities for veterans during Operation 365. Well over half of that was provided by St. Vincent de Paul of Lane County through their innovation, through their working with other nonprofits and with other agencies to leverage the money that Lane County was able to provide to them. And they did it in a superb fashion. You can hardly walk a block in the city of Eugene and the city of Springfield and throughout Lane County without seeing something that St. Vincent de Paul has done to leverage the money that we help provide to them, whether it's pass-through or general money. And for that reason, I first personally started working with the St. Vincent de Paul of Lane County in it was probably 1995 when I was first on the Human Services Commission. And I began to find out the things that the amazing things that they've done for the people of Lane County, things that otherwise wouldn't have happened. Now, beyond that, St. Vincent de Paul does something that other nonprofits don't do. They have revenue generation of their own. They have their thrift stores where they do a remarkable job of not only repurposing goods and clothes for pre-used at lower prices for people to buy and use, but they also do things like they take old mattresses that otherwise would go into the landfill, and they take old mattresses and give them a brand new life. So the remarkable things that happen with Food for Lane County have generated a level of trust of them. Excuse me, I said Food for Lane County, I meant St. Vincent de Paul of Lane County, have generated a degree of trust in them that I simply adore the work that they do. That St. Vincent de Paul of Lane County, in distributing food and repurposing mattresses and generating their own revenue and really leveraging outside money beyond that which is passed through Lane County to do things that otherwise simply would not be done in Lane County. And to that, I not only applaud all the nonprofits in Lane County for the work that they do, that other counties look at our strong and our robust network of nonprofits and wish they had such a network. But I really want to single out St. Vincent de Paul as really being, as I stated, my favorite through all the years because of the breadth of the work that they do. So, any other announcements? Okay. Then we'll move along to future board assignments or requests. Do we have any future board assignments? Commissioner Seneca.
Yeah, after this morning's public testimony and all the support that Patrick Fay was getting, I would like to have staff look into ways of encouraging agritourism. These are small farms that don't have the acreage or equipment to compete with large farms. They're looking for extra revenue streams to survive, and farm to table is a true option here in Lane County. I would like to direct staff to look into any options the county has available to make this happen.
Commissioner Buck.
Thank you. Of course, I support that, although I think that we've already directed staff to do that. But likely more specifically through Alex Kyler's office in the legislative session. So that's already on his laundry list of things to advocate for. So I guess I need some more clarification on like what more are you looking for in this request?
Well, I mean, as we've talked about for the last hour and a half, I mean, is there any flexibility that the county has that we might be able to utilize to get something started?
Okay. Now that sounds very reasonable. Maybe we can have a report back on that?
Absolutely.
Vice Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for bringing this up, Commissioner Seneca. As Commissioner Buck mentioned, I think what we're specifically talking about is the Farm Cafe bill in terms of legislatively addressing the zoning and land use issues. But a report back, maybe, I don't want to put words in your assignment mouth, but also a more sweeping or a broader look at what are some of the initiatives, because there are a lot of really great initiatives around. There's the Lane County Bounty Program, there's the Eugene's Table, which is, value-added product and food and beverage industry sector work and convening that's happening. So whether it's specifically about what can we do to remove barriers that are experienced by small farms, particularly like Patrick Fay's farm, is the specific ask I hear you making, but also are you interested in it being a broader, give us some education and a visiting of what all is happening around our local food economy and what initiatives are going on that we might be able to support or even just amplify with the platform of putting it on an agenda and having a report back. They're sort of two different but related items. I don't know if you want to muddy your assignment waters by making it all of that.
Yes.
Great.
No, I think, I mean, even in the 6 months that I've been here, there's been a lot of traction behind this. And I mean, Oregon Farm Bureau is now behind it, which they weren't in the past. So, I mean, some of those things I think may have opened up some different avenues.
Thank you. Well, I see three head nods already, but Commissioner Lovell.
Yeah, just out of the blue, and forgive my naivete here, but is there any flexibility the board might have to adopt a temporary trial period for said agritourism for the summer of 2023? That we could just say, hey, we want to try something that's not permanent, but just, I don't know, do a 3-month run at it?
For sure.
Although I find that interesting, I think unfortunately, state law prohibits a lot of that work, state land use law. And so, as much as that interests me, we can't violate state law. So if you did that, I think maybe this report back might help potentially uncover maybe legal ways to do that.
You have saw through the cape.
I think this is a good discussion we're having, Ms. Mogreisky, and I think it maybe indicates that there's a lot of interest in this board. And, you know, I've been on the Travel Lane County Board for 10 years, as you have for your entire existence as a Lane County administrator. And you know that one of the things that they want to do is provide destinations inside of Lane County. When people come here for a ball game, for instance, or they come here for a conference, or whatever it may be, reasons to go out into the county. And Commissioner Buck very eloquently stated this morning, that reasons for people to go out and see the things that happen in Lane County that aren't happening inside of urban growth boundaries, that aren't happening right here downtown Eugene or downtown Springfield. And I think finding ways to do that gives us a great opportunity to bring, I don't want to turn Butler Road into a freeway. However, I'd like people to travel up Butler Road to see what's happening at the farms up and down that part of Lane County and other parts of Lane County. And this may be an opportunity for us to determine inside of state law what it is that we might be able to do. So, so I think that may be an urgent assignment request. So I think you have 5 head nods on that.
Yeah, we can provide a report. I mean, and the agritourism issue is not unlike the Goal 5 issue. It's an issue of state concern that Mr. Fay, for example, we've been attempting to work and assist Mr. Fay for a couple of years now. The issues there are all about state law, and as was indicated, we wrote the Farm Cafe bill, and the challenges in you know, got introduced in the legislature. The challenges have been opposition from the farm lobby and Thousand Friends. So there's, you know, I think unfortunately there's a lot of emotion around the challenges that folks have in doing things in unincorporated areas in Lane County and Oregon. The reality is we have a state land use framework that creates a restrictive environment for people to do things on farmland. And so we're fighting against that state framework. So we certainly can bring both a report back on initiatives to support, because we are doing a number of things in the economic development arena, also to support the food and beverage industry more broadly. And so we can talk about that, and we certainly can talk about, you know, is there anything that we can do to, in addition to pursuing legislation, and drafting bills in the legislature. But we certainly can do that.
And we may be able to use some of the work that's already been done by Travel Lane County, by Eugene Cascades and Coast, along those lines. Because they, you know, they've been advocating for a long time for better roads, not roads, but better access to the destinations in Lane County. And we love Lane County. I mean, all the things that are here are amazing. It wasn't that long ago, 12, 14 years ago, that a Board of County Commissioners wanted to end the opportunity to even have a restaurant on a farm or winery. And we've come a long way since then, because we do recognize that we're not destroying anything by inviting people to see Lane County. In fact, we're elevating our opportunities inside of an industry that is flourishing in Lane County, and that is the travel industry. So, very good. All right. Further requests? Then we're down to that point in the agenda, Ms. Mogreisky, where we ask you to review assignments.
So I just have that one. We're not going to make the LMD discussion about Goal 5 because LMD has that to track, but this request to report back on initiatives that we're currently pursuing regarding agritourism and have a discussion with the board about additional options to support that area of work. I don't know the timing of when we can bring that back, but, you know.
Well, let's look at our watch
so.
instead of a calendar. So, no. Thank you, Ms. Mogreisky. Any discussion surrounding that? Then we have no need for executive session today, and our other business has been taken care of as far as I can tell. We will be, I'll be recessing the Board of County Commissioners, at which point we will return tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. for what's going to be a fun discussion regarding the, what is it called, Vice Chair Trigger?
Policy Lab.
The Policy
University
Lab.
of Oregon's Policy Lab.
Our really unique and only county-led partnership with the university in the country that we're of. There are cities that partner with universities on these policy lab models, but we're the first county in the country that is doing it. So it continues to develop, and I won't steal the thunder. But we're excited about it.
Boy, it's always fun when they come back and we see the things that some of the brightest minds in the county are working on, in very uninhibited fashion.
Well, you talk about leveraging. You talked about leveraging earlier, and this is an example of using very little financial resources to leverage the talent, skill, knowledge, interest of students and faculty at the University of Oregon to help assist us on real-world policy challenges that we have here in Lane County.
And Professor Clark has done a good job of assembling and bringing this forward to us for some time now. And I will remind you, Ms. Markreis, in case you had forgotten, that Professor Clark is my representative on the Lane County Charter Review Committee. So he is providing a lot of service to Lane County in so many ways. With that, we are in recess.